Hello, welcome to chapter 3. We're going to talk about process costing in this chapter. So, chapter 2 relates closely to chapter 3. A lot of the accounts we introduced, we will be using pretty much the same accounts, and our journal transactions will be very similar, but our approach will be very different. There is also a couple of new concepts here. One of the crucial concepts that we will learn is called the EUP, the equivalent units of production concept. Okay, so what is process costing? Here we are going to deal with items that are homogeneous, identical, low cost. They're mass produced in an automated continuous production process. So it's difficult, impossible, and not cost effective trying to trace cost to each final unit of production. It's pretty much a series of repetitive process. So each process applies direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead to move towards completion. So here's an example of the trail mix, right? So trail mix will go through different processes until we have the finished product, and it's a continuous, identical, homogeneous product. So we will have to accumulate costs and assign them without regard to the final, how much cost goes to each finished unit. So here are examples of process operations where we're going to use process costing: soft drinks, aluminum, computer chips, gasoline, iPhones, chocolate bars. So here is a great view of comparison between chapter 2 job order costing system and the process costing. And again, you can look at the differences between job orders, which were high cost, customized, heterogeneous, low number of units produced, low standardization, versus this is process costing, homogeneous, high production volume, high standardization. The main difference is that in chapter 2 we only had one WIP inventory, work in process inventory account, and here we will have two or more. So every department will have its own WIP inventory. So if we're making cookies, we would have, let's say, a mixing department, and then the baking department, and then the packaging department. So there will be three WIP inventory accounts: WIP inventory for mixing, separate one WIP for baking, and WIP for packaging, and we will be using direct materials, direct labor, and overhead in all of those departments. And costs will be transferred to the finished goods inventory only from the WIP packaging department, right? You cannot move from WIP mixing to finished goods. So you have to go from one WIP to another, and only from the last department, the last manufacturing process WIP inventory, we will transfer completed finished goods to the finished goods inventory. And then it goes from finished goods to COGS in the same manner it happened in chapter 2. So our goal here is really to think about those WIP accounts. And the goal is, what is my cost? What are my production costs for the ending balance for every WIP account, and for the completed and transferred out amounts for every WIP department? It's really, our focus is just the ending balance and the completed transferred out amount, both costs and units for each of those WIP departments, WIP inventory accounts. So again, this was chapter 2. We accumulated production or manufacturing costs per job, and there was one WIP, and then it went to finished goods and then to COGS. Here you can see that our product or manufacturing costs are used. Now they're using an example of Jelly Belly here. So we have the centers process, the shells process, the packaging process. So therefore we have three WIP inventory accounts. And guys, each WIP account is using direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. So because we need to use more direct materials when we make shells, we need to use more direct materials when we package the Jelly Bellies, we need to use more direct labor, we're using more overhead. So my direct materials, direct labor, and overhead are used in all of those three departments, and every department's inventory, WIP inventory, has the beginning balance and then completed units for that department will be transferred to the next week, to the next WIP, and only from the WIP for packaging, the finished product will go to finished goods inventory. So I hope it makes sense. Really, the difference is just we have multiple WIP inventory accounts. Okay. So a couple of ideas here. One which we need to understand, and we did distinguish this in chapter 1, conversion costs. We talked about prime costs in chapter 1 versus conversion costs. We just need to know conversion costs. And conversion costs are direct labor plus overhead. So direct materials will be separated. We will use direct materials on its own. And just not to keep track of 3 different costs, just to make it a little bit simpler, your textbook, your problems will refer to CC conversion costs, which means direct labor plus overhead. So sometimes conversion costs will be given to you. Sometimes they will give you direct labor and overhead separately. So you just add them together. And the second concept is the EUP, equivalent units of production. To use process costing, we have 2 different methods. One method is called weighted average, and this is what we're going to use in this textbook. The second method is called FIFO. It's covered in the appendix, and we will not be using it for our regular homework or tests. So we will only be using weighted average, and I will explain why it's important. So the equivalence units of production here, you can think about different rules. But if you think about, baking cookies, and if you think about the mixing department, right, or baking department, the cookies that are transferred out, they're 100% complete. But the cookies that stay in the ending inventory, they're partially complete. So if I have 1,000 units, 1,000 cookies, and they're incomplete, I want to know, well, this 1,000 units would be equal to how many completed cookies. So if they're 80% complete, it means I have 1,000 incomplete cookies, which is equal to 800 fully completed cookies. So instead of 1,000 units, I would use 800 of equivalent units of production. Another way of thinking about it, I have an information here about Chabot College students. We have full-time students and part-time students. So if we just count students, we have 16,000 of them. But for the different purposes, especially for being paid by the state wants to know, well, how many full-time equivalent students do we have? So we have 7,000 of full-time students, and 9,000 students are part-timers. Some take 3 units, some take 6 units, some take 9 units, but they're not taking full-time load. So we estimate that one part-time student is about 40% of the equivalent of the full-time student. So instead of 12 units, they're taking whatever the number, 8 units or something like that. Not 8, 5 units. And so even though there are 16,000 students, we report to the state 7,000 full-time students, and instead of 9,000 part-timers, they are 40% equivalent to full-time students, which equals to 3,600. So together, we report that we have 10,600 full-time equivalent students. It's not really 16,000 heads. 16,000 heads or people are equal to 10,600 full-time equivalent students. So if everybody was taking a full-time load, it would be equal to 10,600 students. This is what we're going to use here. These are very important rules. I will emphasize them again. Whatever we're transferring out, whatever is completed, is going to be 100% complete in regards to both direct materials and conversion costs. Whatever is completed will be, of course, 100% complete. Otherwise, we cannot transfer it to the next department. We only will have to really focus for the EUP in this class, in this chapter, only for ending WIP. Only looking at the unfinished, incomplete units. Only we need to know and calculate EUP for ending WIP. Because transferred out units, they are 100% complete. And for the ending WIP, we will always separate direct materials and conversion costs, as I mentioned before. We will assume, which is not necessarily always the case, but all examples in this textbook will always assume that my ending WIP, those units, 100% complete in regards to direct materials, right? If you start mixing cookies and baking cookies, right, you already used all the flour, all the sugar, all the eggs, you mixed it together, but you haven't completely cooked them or baked them. So in regards to labor and overhead, we will need to use more of those in the next period. So conversion cost for the engine whip will be the only area where we will be given a different percentage. And this percentage will be less than 100, and it will be given to you. It will change from a problem to a problem. Okay, so I think it will make more sense if I just go over some examples. This is what you have to generate in this chapter. You will have to generate so-called process cost report. Process costing report, which will include 4 components. That's the majority of this chapter. I want to, now, this report, the way it's given, makes simple matters more complicated than they need to be. So I want to show you an example, a simplified example of what we're talking about, okay? So let's say we're making here, let's say we're baking cookies, right? So if you think about your whip inventory, I want to think about beginning balance, and I'm just making up the numbers. So let's say that I have 30 unfinished cookies, could be 30,000, doesn't matter, but I'll say 30. 30 unfinished cookies from the previous period. That's my beginning balance. I'm going to start it and use more direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Additional, I will say, 60 cookies. So together we're gonna have with you 90 cookies. Let me do this plus right here. And guys, these 90 cookies is what we need to account for. I will need to account for all of them. I had 30, I started 60, I have a total of 90. So on the other hand, at the end of the month, how many did we completed and transferred out? Completed, transferred out, meaning it went to the next whip or to the finished goods, depending on what part of process we're at. And completed, and then, engine balance. And guys, like engine balance, I will put in yellow because it might not be given, but it's very easy to calculate. So out of this 90, how many did we complete? I'm making it up. I'll say 50. So engine balance you have to figure out, right? But engine balance would be 90 minus 50. So you had 30 plus, you started 60, together 90, out of them 50 are complete. So how many is incomplete or engine balance? Of course it would be 40, right? Right here, 40 units. And guys, so 50 plus 40 again is going to be equal to 90, and this is what's accounted for, right? And accounted for. So we always will have to prove that the number as well as costs of what to account for is equal to what's accounted for, right? We have to reconcile. Okay, so the units will be given to you. And then the percentages will be given to you, like right here, and I'm making it up. It would say, well, out of the beginning balance, these cookies were 60% complete. But I will say here, this 60% complete, let me put here this asterisk. And what I mean right here is that, for the purposes of the weighted average, ignore it. If you're given beginning balance percentage completeness, we don't need to use it. When you're using the weighted average, and that's the only method you're going to use in this chapter, you just ignore it. Don't worry about it. You would use it if you had to use FIFO, and we're not covering it. You will cover it if you take cost accounting, right? Completed, of course, it's like, if they're completed, it's not given to you, but it's going to be 100%. Otherwise, they would not have been completed. And this, I'm just making up, this is the important one, 80%. So again, I want to go back to the slide, and it says right here, let me go right here, we only will need to calculate EUP for conversion costs of engine whip only. Only this percentage will matter. Now, for simplicity here, I am not separating each of these into direct materials and conversion costs. But in a lot of your problems, you will be given separate information, beginning balance, how much is direct materials versus conversion cost started, completed, engine balance. Okay? So, equivalent units of production. So how many of completed units are complete? 50, right? 50 units multiplied by 100%. So equivalent units are the same as actual units. But right here, 40 units, but they're only 80% complete. So I multiplied. So instead of 40, I'm going to be using 32. And I want to know this total. So my total units of production here are going to be 82. And so we are using so-called weighted average method. So to calculate cost per equivalent unit of production, this is, or what is the weighted average cost per EUP? Weighted average cost per equivalent unit of production. We need to take total production costs and we will divide it into this total EUP. So the problem also has to give you cost information, and I'm making it up, right? So let's say my beginning balance was $92. Again, this is units, this is costs. And started would be, I'm making it up, $400. So together it is $492. And again, this is the amount we have to account for. Part of that amount is completed and transferred out, and part of that amount will stay with the engine balance, right? So together it's 492. 492. So the formula for the weighted average cost per equivalent unit of production is my total cost divided by total EUP. Now, for your problems, you will have to calculate it separately for direct materials and conversion costs, which just separates it into two different calculations. But here, I'm going to just keep it simple. I'm going to use it more simple way. So, total EUP, let me calculate it here. Let me just calculate it right here. So, my total cost is 492 and our total units of production is 82 EUPs. So my weighted average cost per EUP is then $6 per EUP. There we go. Okay, doesn't want to let me, so let's do it this way. Okay. Let's do this way. And this way, and I'll just put it in yellow. This is our main calculation. This is what we're doing, right? And now, so I completed 50 units. 50 units multiplied by $6. 50 units, and they're equal to EUP because they're completed. So I'm going to assign $300. I'm going through all this calculation to know, well, how much cost to assign to the units completed and transferred out, and how much cost to assign to the engine balance. And we have 32 EUPs, not 40, 32 at $6 of cost, production cost per EUP, and that's 192. And guys, also we reconcile. You can see that 300 plus 192 is equal to 492. So whatever I had to account for is now accounted for. This is the simple way. Now your textbook makes it a little bit more complicated, but this is the idea. I hope it makes sense. Okay. So let me actually stop here and I will record the second part of the video and I will actually walk you through the process costing report the way it's presented in your textbook. Thank you.